Prof. O'Connell, we can start. Thank you.
Welcome to the 9th ASSAf Humanities annual lecture entitled The Humanities, Critical Thought in a Time of Crisis by Professor Anthony Bogues. Professor Himna Sudyal, Executive Officer of ASSAf, sends apologies as she's traveling. I'm Sheena O'Connell, Chair of the ASSAf Humanities Standing Committee. Thank you all for attending, and thank you to all of those behind the scenes who have made this possible. A few house rules. Please ensure that your phone is muted and that your video is off. And please post your questions in the chat box, and we will try to get to as many of you as time allows. It is my privilege now to introduce you to Professor Loretta Ferris, Vice Principal Academic at the University of Pretoria, and one of South Africa's leading environmental law scholars. Her work spans environmental justice, human rights, and indigenous knowledge systems, informing policy at national and international level. Previously Deputy Vice Chancellor for Transformation and Student Affairs at UCT, she has consistently connected rigorous scholarship to real societal impact. In November 2024, Professor Ferris was elected to the ASSAf Council, and today she joins us to speak about ASSAf, its work, and its significance for science and scholarship in South Africa. Welcome, Professor Ferris, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor O'Connell, and good afternoon to all of our colleagues, all of our guests, and in particular, our guest lecturer today, Professor Bogues. It's a pleasure to welcome you on behalf of ASSAf to this event this afternoon. This is our 9th ASSAf Humanities annual lecture, which we proudly host as the Academy of Science in South Africa. The Academy of Science of South Africa was established in 1996, and it serves as the National Academy of Science for our country. Its mandate is not only to recognize excellence in scholarship, but to also provide independent and evidence-based advice on matters of societal importance, and to create spaces such as this space where scholars, policymakers, the public can engage meaningfully on the issues that shapes our collective future. Now, within this mandate, the annual Humanities Lecture occupies a particularly important place. Since its establishment in 2017, the lecture has become a flagship platform through which ASSAf highlights the indispensable role of the humanities in helping us understand the complexities of our societies and of our democracies. Now, at a time when public discourse is often dominated by technological innovation, data, scientific breakthroughs, and rightly so, it is equally important to recognize that science and technology alone cannot answer the deep questions confronting humanity, and perhaps more so now than ever as we are increasingly challenged by rapidly evolving technology. And as the theme of today's lecture suggests, humanities, critical thought in a time of crisis, we do find ourselves in a world marked by profound challenges. I think you cannot but avoid the moment that we are in right now as a world, and the rapidly escalating nature of the conflicts in the Middle East and what it will have for the world as just one of those moments of crisis. But amidst all of this, and probably underlying all of the crisis moments that we are experiencing is also the deepening and widening inequality that we find ourselves in. And as I've mentioned previously, disruptive effects of new technologies, and then also just overarchingly, the ongoing struggles for justice, for recognition across all of our societies. And in moments such as this, the humanities do something essential. They offer the intellectual tools to interpret the present, but also to interrogate power. And as we do so, to remember the histories that shape our current realities, but then also, on a more positive note, to imagine different futures. So the humanities reminds us that societies are not simply governed by systems and by institutions, but by ideals, by values, by ethical choices, and by ideas. And this is precisely why ASSAf continues to host and invest in spaces like this lecture series. By convening leading thinkers and scholars, the annual Humanities lecture strengthens the relationship between knowledge and society, ensuring that scholarly insight informs public dialogue and democratic life. It is therefore fitting that today's lecture will be delivered by a scholar whose work exemplifies the power and the reach of the humanities. Professor Bogues will be properly introduced by Professor Sheena O'Connell, but suffice it to say that the work of Professor Bogues traverses disciplines: history, political theory, art, cultural criticism. So it demonstrates that in the time that we are in, we need to be willing to work across what we believe to be our disciplinary expertise. It also demonstrates the need to employ intellectual courage as academics and as scholars, and to confront the realities of the crisis that we face and to confront it in ways that are bold. And today's lecture invites us to reflect on the role of the humanities precisely in this spirit, as a field that does not merely interpret the world, but that helps us engage with it critically and responsibly. So on behalf of ASSAf, thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Professor Ferris. It is one of the great privileges of an intellectual life to encounter a mind that genuinely changes the way you see, not just the world, but the very categories through which we make sense of it. I have had that privilege for over 17 years through a friendship and the kind of sustained intellectual companionship that reshapes your own thinking in ways you keep discovering long after the conversation has ended. Professor Anthony Bogues is a writer, scholar, and curator whose work moves across African diasporic political thought, Caribbean intellectual history, and the art of the Black Atlantic. At the center of everything he does is a set of questions about what it means to be human, questions whose philosophical depth is inseparable from the historical and political stakes. His 11 books, over 100 articles, and a curatorial practice spanning continents have opened up new intellectual terrain for scholars across the globe. And I've watched that happen with particular intensity here in South Africa, where his influence on young scholars has been and continues to be genuinely transformative. Professor Bogues is the ASSAf Professor of Humanities and Africana Studies and a professor in the history of art and architecture at Brown University in the US, where he was the inaugural director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. He is a distinguished visiting professor and curator at the University of Johannesburg and a professor at large of the Africa Institute in Sharjah. He was recently awarded an honorary Doctor of Literature by SOAS, University of London, a recognition of a lifetime's contribution to African and African diasporic thought and the intellectual and artistic traditions of the Caribbean. His current projects speak for themselves: a manuscript titled Black Critique, an intellectual biography of Sylvia Wynter, whose unpublished writings he's also co-editing, biographies of C.L.R. James and Michael Manley, and a collaborative art historical study of the Haitian Revolution. His curatorial work has the same reach: film documentary This Life, Black Life in the Time of the Now, premiered at Art Basel, Miami in December 2023, and the Global Curatorial Project exhibition opened recently at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture in Washington, D.C. He also convenes the UNESCO project Mapping Global Anti-Black Racism and serves on the editorial collective of Boundary 2. He received his PhD in political theory from the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. In 1994, and in the decades since, he has changed the questions available to us, to all of us. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anthony Bogues. Over to you.
Thank you all very much. And thank you very much, Professor O'Connell, for that introduction. Thank you very much, Professor Ferris, for the overarching introduction to this particular lecture series. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to begin by thanking the Academy of Science of South Africa for inviting me to deliver this lecture. As an Afro-Caribbean individual, my connections to continental Africa is a deep historical one. Specifically in relationship to South Africa, since April 1994, when I was part of the Commonwealth Observer team participating in the first democratic elections, I have spent an enormous amount of time in South Africa. During my first visit there in 1994, I spent time in KwaZulu-Natal and in Joburg with a visit to Cape Town. I've always felt a special relationship to South Africa. I have spent extensive time at the University of Cape Town, and one of the things that I remember very well is meeting with a group of Black students who had just entered the university, but who wanted to understand whether or not there was something called African and African diaspora intellectual history and political thought. With these students, I engaged in a series of vigorous seminars outside of the classroom. And I would say to you all that given in my entire scholarly life, I have never met a more extraordinary group of students, extremely bright and gifted, but who in 2006, when I was in South Africa, were grappling, 12 years after the fall of legal apartheid, were grappling with a certain kind of understanding of knowledge and wanted to know something else. At that time in 2012, there was hope, and not just in South Africa, but in other spaces. Certainly, the world today is a different place. Today, we inhabit a different world. And as Stuart Hall would say, we inhabit a different conjuncture. It is a conjuncture of authoritarianism and of illiberalism. It is a conjuncture in which technology and violence combine to create new weapons of human destruction, called sometimes unmanned combat aerial vehicles. It is a world in which death is often at our doorstep. It is a world in which there's the creation of death worlds, in which is a part of everyday regularity of life. So much so that human life is now told through tales of death. It is a conjuncture in which there is the emergence of a new world elite, an elite that is connected deeply to technology, an elite that believes in something called technological futurism, an elite that believes in something called transhumanism, an elite that wants to build cities based on all eugenic principles in which there would be superior humans, usually white, an elite in which they draw from racial theories of the European colonial projects, of racial plantation slavery in the Americas, and of course, of apartheid. It is a time, as one poet would say to us, where the best seem to lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. In such a world, what is the work of the humanities? And particularly for us in Africa and the African diaspora, how does the humanities, in quotation marks, operate, and what can it has to offer in such a configuration? To think through this question, we begin from the frame of what the Congolese scholar Mudimbe said to us in his remarkable book of Invention of Africa, in which he talks about what he calls the colonial library. The colonial library, Mudimbe makes clear, has within it deep anthropological and pseudoscientific methods of the study of Africa, and I would argue of the African diaspora. In his book, Invention of Africa, Mudimbe notes the following, and here I quote him, that the missionary discourses were central to the signs and symbols of the cultural model of study, and that along with the traveler's account and anthropologists' interpretations, that this was the order of knowledge of Africa and the African diaspora. I think that it is important to understand, as Mudimbe says, goes on, that the two particular important texts were operated at the inauguration of this colonial library. The first was a text published in 1870. That's even before the Scramble for Africa, by Henry Morgan. And the name of the text is Systems and the Affinity of Human Family, with a conceptual schema of 7 stages of development. Dr. Morgan made it clear that the 7 stages of development were, and here I quote him, lower savagery, middle savagery, upper savagery, lower barbarism, middle barbarism, upper barbarism, and then civilization. One of the important things I think to understand in the humanities, particularly from the Western frame, is how categories are organized, how hierarchical schemas and classification schemas are organized in which human beings are put within that schema. The second, I think, important text that, and I would agree with Mudimbe on this, is the text that was published in 1910 by Lucien Brunels. And it's the title of that text is How Natives Think. One line from that particular text says the following, and here I quote it, the slightest mental effort involving abstract reasoning, however elementary it may be, is distasteful to them meaning Africans. In other words, one of the things I'm pointing out is that at the inauguration, or when the so-called humanities is encountered African people of African descent, then Africans and people of African descent were considered to be pre-logical. They were considered to be irrational. They were considered to belong to another stage, if you wish, of human civilization. Central to this form of knowledge is what I like to call, if Mudimbe calls it the colonial library, central to this knowledge order is something that one would like to call the colonial episteme. The colonial episteme becomes the overarching frame for a series of classification hierarchies in which Africans and people of African descent were placed at the bottom of a hierarchical totem pole. The African body was understood to be an uncivilized one, a savage one. And perhaps over time, in some colonial systems, particularly the British colonial tutelage, would mean that this particular body might become, quote unquote, respectable and civilized. It was, however, in the words of Sylvia Wynter, the Caribbean theorist, a body of lack and therefore a body of disposability. What this means in terms of knowledge orders was that the humanities and the humanitas in Latin was about the study of European societies, Western civilization. And the anthropos, anthropology, was then seen as a study of societies like African societies. I would want to argue that the various fields of study, political studies, historical studies, social sciences, or what some people now call humanistic social sciences, that all of these things are still on the table, that they are still, in fact, there are systems of thought that undergird how we see Africa and the African diaspora. They do not remain unchallenged today, of course, that the assumptions that were in them about uncivilization and savage Africans and people whose bodies are disposable, that those things are actually still are being challenged today. But the colonial library, which although it has no longer exists without any contestation, therefore it still frames, I would argue, the way we think about Africa and the African diaspora. It is a reason why, as late as 2007, the French president can talk about an African people that have not yet entered, and here I quote him, history. Or we can remember what the current United States president, the phrase that he used to describe African societies as well as Caribbean societies, and in which, in his world, the third world in quotation, is a term of abuse. I would suggest to you all on this webinar that from 1947, when India gained its independence, 1957, when Ghana then gained its independence, that the moment of political decolonization was an important one. It was the one in which the political forms of empire fell, of the colonial empire fell. But that, importantly, the colonial episteme did not fall with it. Hence today, in many quarters, there is the call for decolonization, particularly in the world of museums, and decolonization in thought. At the heart of this arguments about decolonization are ways in which we can begin to see, because I would also argue that seeing is also a form of knowledge. And one of the arguments about decolonization is about representation. And representation, in the words of Stuart Hall, is really a process and a system in which, as Stuart says, conceptual maps of the world are formed. But the argument that one wants to make is that, is the representation enough? Do we not need to do something else? And is there not, if you wish, another way, another level, if you want to use that language, in which we must grapple with the world in which we live in from the point of view or the perspectives of the humanities? Secondly, I would want to suggest to you that on thinking about the humanities, one of the important issues is the business of the human itself. Not who we are, which I would argue is a question of nationality and ethnicity, but rather what we are and what it is that we actually may become. In the Western humanities, this question of the human is typically tied to a certain notion of personhood. As we all know, the history of this Western humanities comes out of the Renaissance humanism of the West, a kind of knowledge and practices which underpin a certain kind of liberal ethos. Its object of inquiry and its epistemological methods are distinct from those, of course, in the natural sciences, or what we call today generally STEM. History is about the past. Philology in the humanities is about language. Literary criticism is about literature. Philosophy itself is about a history of thought. But the problematic here is that in each of these particular fields, each of these particular disciplines, and which are supposed to be about our engagement with the human world, that this kind of hermeneutic, the kind of interpretation that is framed in a certain way. It is framed by the order of the colonial episteme still. This, in my view, is nothing. That means that there is nothing universal in the fields that I have spoken about: philosophy, literature, political studies, historical studies. That the actual categories of these particular disciplines, perhaps, not perhaps, I think, but in many ways, are mired in and tethered to a certain kind of colonial episteme. But the colonial episteme and the categories created by Europe, in the words of George Lamin, the Caribbean writer and novelist, does not make Europe the universe, and here I quote him, does not make Europe the universal teacher. At the heart, though, of this humanities, as it is constructed by the West, is a certain kind of understanding of and a certain specific mode of what has just been called, in a book that was just published by Oxford 2 weeks ago on the humanities, what they call a specific mode of personhood. It is this specific mode of personhood that I want to tarry for a while on. Sylvia Winter, the Caribbean theorist who I've made mention before, makes the point in her work that we need to have a particular alternative history of the human. We need to think about what I like to call the modes of the production of the human, and how we think about the human as a praxis, particularly since, in her view, since 1492, when the world was connected through the Columbian voyages, but not connected in any way of equal. It was connected through a colonial project, and therefore of profound human inequality. Winter makes the point that there are different forms of what one might call personhood, to use that language of the Oxford publication. That is, since 1492, that there is a Christian man, she argues, there's a political man, and there's what she argues, Homo economicus. So that personhood, therefore, or being human at a certain point, if we understand the human as praxis, is not an abstraction. It is rooted in a certain kind of social world that we have constructed. It is rooted in a certain kind of theoretical significations and language structures, and of course, symbolic orders that we have all created. From this perspective, I think it's important to understand three things. Firstly, that the ways in which the human life is conducted, the frames and narratives which undergird our practices of life, become actually central to our practice as being as humans. So language becomes extremely important, but not just language, but speech and thought that is organized by language becomes, and narratives becomes extremely important. It also means that we have to think through very much that how we organize the language that we think and the language that we speak about and we speak through is languages that may actually be very important in shaping our desire and our understanding of ourselves as human beings, so that there's a way in which language becomes not just communication, but becomes a sign of us as human beings. And then importantly, how we speak about what we speak and what we say in that language then becomes a way for us to think about ourselves as humans itself, what we are as human beings. The second point I want to make is that the particular inventions, driven today by technological advancement, and I use that word very, very difficultly actually, because there is a side to this drive for technology, which I think we need to pay significant attention to, is that the idea of the question of technology is that it is accompanied both by two things. It is accompanied by a certain kind of establishment of a system of surveillance of human life, but it is also very much accompanied by, as I said, the rise of a technological elite that has a certain understanding of the role of technology in life, human life, which I'll speak about in a minute. The third thing I want to talk about, I'm trying to think about this idea of the human and of personhood, is the historical process. And to understand that the historical processes are like what I call sedimentary deposit. James Baldwin, the African-American novelist, says that history travels in our bodies. And what I would want to suggest to you all is that in this moment of illiberalism and the moment of authoritarianism, that what we are seeing is a reorganization of the secular colonial project that had gone not underground, but was always there. In other words, the point I want to make is that the secular colonial logics, the racial logics of the secular colonialism, the idea that might is right, the ideas about war and how war becomes is central to the human experience in ways in which life, life becomes destroyed. Human life is destroyed. That those kind of things come out of a sector colonial logic, both in United States as well as in as well as in continental Africa. And that therefore one of the things we might want to think about is not a certain kind of liberal democratic frame, but actually to think about how that liberal democratic frame is actually tied to an underbelly of a certain kind of illiberalism, and that at this specific moment in time, that what we are living through is the emergence of that illiberalism as it attempts to dominate the world. And that in this particular moment, this particular moment of illiberalism, what is, I think, is important is to remember the Fanonian injunction in The Wretched of the Earth, where he says that Europe talks a lot about man, but what I see when Europe talks about man is the death of man. Given all of these things that I've just tried to summarize, one should not be surprised at the various features of the present conjuncture. We should be deeply worried and concerned, yes, but not necessarily surprised. And in such a context, therefore, what is the work of the humanities? What is the ways in which we can kind of have an hermeneutics of the social world, grapple with the social world which we make and which we currently inhabit? The first task I would want to suggest, or there are many tasks, but one of the key tasks I would want to suggest is the business of the decolonial, the overturn of the colonial episteme. And I would argue that at the heart of the overturn of the colonial episteme is a question of language. In other words, how can we think about not language as grammar, but how can we begin to think about the language in which we speak, and therefore the language in which we think? Fanon made a point in Black Skin, White Mask at the very beginning that to speak and to think of, and to speak a language, he says, is actually to inhabit, and here I'm paraphrasing him, is to habit a civilization. So what are the ways in which, when we're thinking about the overturn of the colonial episteme, and we're thinking about in the South African context, what are the ways in which Bantu languages actually become critical as a way for us that to think differently, to begin to think about different kind of cosmologies, and therefore about a certain kind of possibilities about ourselves as human. Secondly, is how in this business of the humanities, how then do we tell the story of the human? How do we tell a story in which it is not, and we are, the way in which both Fanon, I think, and Winter makes this point in different ways, is that we are both biology and we are both culture. And that the idea of us being a biological cultural beings means that we actually tell ourselves stories. And when I say stories here, I mean that we actually engage in a narrative set of practices that talk about us, that tell us what we are and who we are and what we might become. And so one of the things I want to argue is that we might want to think about what kind of stories can we tell ourselves about ourselves. And in telling those new stories about ourselves, then what kind of histories can we also narrate? And here I want to just suggest that there is a way in which we have to think about the telling of stories, not now from the archive, the storage archive that exists in the various states that we inhabit, but we have to begin to think about these stories from the perspective of what I like to call the archive of the ordinary. In other words, in what ways have ordinary people attempted to live as human beings, sometimes successfully, sometimes not so successfully, sometimes contradictorily, sometimes not. So that, in other words, there's no kind of a pristine way to think about these matters. All these matters about us as human beings are actually complex because we ourselves are complex creatures. But I think what is important in terms of trying to tell these new stories is what Fanon would call an understanding of the capacity of ourselves as human beings to invent and reinvent ourselves. The third element or third thing I think that one might want to think about is what is this business of trying to understand that at the heart of the humanities, of particularly Western humanities, as it presents itself is that it presents itself, in the words of Amy Césaire, as a kind of pseudo-humanism. And I want to just grapple with this humanism for a moment, because this is how, in the conventional way we think about the humanities, we think about the human, but we also think about this humanism. But there's a different way, I think, to begin to understand this business of the human and to discard humanism, Western humanism. And it is this: we are in a particular moment in which we can say that there is a tradition of what some of us call a Black radical or Black or anti-colonial thought. And that the question that is one question that is posed for us is, what is the figure of the human in this thought? In other words, what is understood to be personhood in this particular trajectory, in this particular configuration of thought? Recall that I said previously that the idea of Western humanism is rested within a kind of notion of Renaissance humanism, in which, as Sylvia Wynter said, the West got to the position where they de-godded thought. Recall also that I said that the European colonial projects have set up and established a series of classificatory schemas in which who was human and who was not was paramount. So when we think, however, about a different history, when we think about the possibility of a different modes of being human, then we have to ask ourselves, with Fanon, with Césaire, and people like Amilcar Cabral and Wynter, we have to make a certain kind of demand about personhood, a new kind of history, which I think we need to begin to think about. This new kind of history does not posit us as Homo economicus, does not posit us as the human as primarily being productive. There's a way in which critical theory, critical thought that comes out of the West still posits us as human beings as primarily productive, primarily a way, and that productivity is in fact the sign of being human, is a sign of the species itself. But what happens if we have a different way of thinking about the human? And I'm not against productivity. What happens if we think about the human as primarily in relationship? In other words, as primarily relational. What does it mean to overturn a conception of the self as us being primarily productive entities? What does it mean to overturn a construction of the liberal self as really just a liberal individual with no particular connections to the society? What happens if we talk about the human as a relational self? How then does that impact upon the humanities itself, and then make the humanities a studies of human practices about these particular kind of relations, whether it is history or language? One of the things that has happened in social sciences and in the humanistic social sciences is that we think about society as a structure. We think about, and then what we do is we abstract those structures to a level of abstraction in which human beings do not exist. What happens if we begin to think about that structures are actually relational, that structures are constituted by us as human beings, and that they are constituted within relations? So that if you have an economic structure, it is not a kind of abstract scientific understanding of how economics plays out, but really is about to understand that economic relations are essentially relations of people of people to people in the actual production of goods and services to use that language. So that to think about, therefore, to begin to think about deconstructing, if you wish to use that language, of deconstructing the actual categories that we have in which we think about ourselves. But to think of deconstruct those categories in relationship to, or in a way in which we understand ourselves as relational rather than just as simply productive human beings. There's a kind of history of the human that we then need to talk about. Not the history just of a Darwinian way of evolution, not just the history of Adam Smith kind of Homo economicus, but a different kind of history of the human in which we think about questions of relationality. And if we do that kind of study, if we begin to think about the human in that kind of way, then I would want to argue that it might be possible to begin to set up a world in which we do not necessarily create the current death worlds that we have, because one of the things that we will do is actually overturn the classificatory schemas about disposability, classificatory schemas about human beings, classificatory schemas in which we are supposed to be at the bottom of the totem pole. If we begin to do those kind of things, then we begin to study the different fields, history, philology, etc., political studies. All those different fields, in my view, are studied now not in silos, but are studied in relationship to one another. Because I would want to argue that what you are looking at is the human being, the human as a practice, the human being constituting him or herself as a set of practices throughout a human world that we have created, throughout a certain kind of understanding of history, where we understand that history are these practices through temporally. That means it happens in time. This means that we need to recast the humanities. And we recast the humanities, therefore, as a critical critique. We recast the humanities as critical thought, but not as critical thought in which there are absolutions. In other words, that there's a way in which to understand a certain complexity, I would argue, a certain, what Stuart Hall will argue, a certain contingency about what it is that we are and who we are. And particularly for humanities scholars, the way I like to put it, and I said this in a lecture yesterday at Duke University, is that one of the things we do is that we write about a particular period, we write about a particular human action, but by the time we actually get onto the computer to write it, that action may have already passed. And therefore we are in a moment, but that moments themselves are actually not permanent. That is what shows, as I said, a certain kind of contingency, and that we ourselves should be aware of that contingency. As we recast the humanities as critical thought, not as a series of fossilized disciplines in the social world, we might then return to what Aimé Césaire de Martinican says, where we develop a certain kind of humanism made to the measure of the world. This is not the humanism of the West. This is not the illiberal humanism, but rather is a radical creation of a world of freedom, a world of radical forms of equality. And it is a world in which politics is really about the common frame of association. Politics is about a common form of association, not about questions of might and power. From these, if we do this, then we might be able to escape the elements of this present moment. We might be able to shape a different kind of world. Amilcar Cabral, one of the most important, I think, African thinkers from Guinea-Bissau, made the point that the one feature of liberation, he says, was, here I quote him, was a certain kind of reclamation of history. End of quote. It was not a return, I would argue, to our past, but rather an engagement with the past, but an engagement which does not tether the past to any colonial legacy, but rather a kind of working through to overturn in the present the colonial episteme and to create different knowledge orders. In doing this, I will argue, following from Cabral, that what we are talking about is the clearing in the humanities as critical thought, is the clearing of a new ground, is the clearing of a new ground to write the story of a different society and of different possibilities. In this engagement, the humanities becomes a site of criticality. It becomes a site of criticality that deconstructs what it is that where we are and what the dominant discourses about who and what we are, but it is also has a reconstruction process, a kind of reconstruction of what we can become. In doing that, the humanities will then become a critical field of study rather than a kind of fossilized field of banal statements. Thanks very much for listening to me.
Professor Bogues, thank you very much. I'm glad that I'm not Professor Kevin Thomas, who has the task of responding to this, because at least it gives me some time to pause and think and reflect. Professor Kevin Thomas is Dean of the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Pretoria and a leading neuropsychologist, trained at Harvard, USC, and the University of Arizona. He has over 100 peer-reviewed publications and has attracted funding from the NRF, MRC, and the US NIH. He recently co-founded the African Neuropsychology Network, dedicated to growing the discipline across the continent. Professor Thomas, it is over to you to respond to this talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. O'Connell. It's very kind of you to give me that introduction, and I will say that you're not the first person to say you're happy not to be me. I want to thank Prof. Ferris for her earlier introduction, and of course Prof. Bogues for a really inspiring and thought-provoking lecture that I'm going to try to respond to as best I can now. I'll start by just revisiting some of the key themes, and then talking about some questions that might help us push some of these arguments a little bit farther on. So the lecture poses a question that's both old and new and urgent in a different way. And that question, of course, is what's the work of humanities in a moment of crisis? And one might argue that the humanities itself is always responding to crisis, that we are always in a state of permacrisis within the humanities, and whether those crises are internal, sort of questioning itself, what is the value of the humanities, or whether we're responding to something external. So those are crises imposed on us by the world. But it feels that humanities, perhaps uniquely, is always responding to moments of crisis. And where Prof. Bogues started out with an opening there, and the first key theme was that the crisis that we face now is inhabiting a different world, what he called a different conjuncture, a world where there's a conjunction of death being very much a part of the regularity of life, where you have an emergence of elites who believe in old eugenic principles alongside techno-futurism, and that conjuncture exists. And the conjuncture exists of violence being almost inextricably conjoined to the emergence of these new technologies. And so what we have there is a world that is marked by technological disruption, by widening inequalities, by war, by renewed imperialism. And um, that's the underlying theme here of technology that we may have associated with generating new forms of prosperity and wealth are actually really generating precarity and instability. And then the next theme there is how did we get to the current state of the humanities? And Prof. Bogues talked about the colonial library and uh, colonial episteme and how those hierarchies and taxonomies, the classifications, the categories, how those established power relationships between the colonized and the colonists, one being deemed as pre-logical or pre-civilized, and the other being deemed as being the height of civilization or the epitome of what civilization should be. And what this leads us to situations where systems of thought within the classical humanities disciplines, political sciences, sociology, anthropology, etc., psychology, not least, are framed by this colonial library and these epistemological principles. And we have across all of those fields an epistemological injustice that is not completely overturned. Of course, it's not completely overturned by political decolonization, and it is not completely uh, overturned by new ways of thinking about what the decolonial project is. And the decolonial project, just as an aside, you will say, is in some ways is very reactive. And it takes a form that is quite different, I think, than to what Prof. Bogues has recommended to us here, which is a radical untethering, which comes in a later part of the themes. So the major theme then that I detected here is the heart of the classical humanities and the way that we think about it, given the colonial episteme, is a particular kind of way of thinking of what humans are, very Western, Homo economicus. And that informs our approach to humanities. It informs the way that we think, it informs the methods that we use, it informs the measures that we hold to be the way that the world ought to work and how we ought to measure it. And so the question then is, what is an alternative? How do we think of humanhood or personhood differently? How can we practice differently? And one of the things that really struck home to me, there's two of them, um, in what Prof. Bogue said around the work of humanities in this world of different conjunctures. One is language, and language is of course key to overturning the colonial episteme. And there are different possibilities inherent in the way that we use language differently. But it's not just using different languages, but it is in the way that we construct languages and how we interpret the forms of language. And something that sticks with me, and whenever I think about decolonial projects, is something that Peter Vale has said in his writings and in some of the talks I've seen him give, which is that language is both a key to freedom and a prison. And so language can open up doors. It can open up ways of communication between people. But also, when you speak a particular language, you're imprisoned within the bounds of that language. And when we are, for instance, in our academic disciplines and in our universities, and all we're using is English, we are bound by the parameters of English. And we're bound by what that means as a language, as a colonial language. So that's one way of thinking of what are the possibilities then of using language differently, not just different languages, but using a language differently. And the second is that how to tell the story of humans. And Prof. Bogue said that we are both biology and culture. And we through biology and through culture, we drive narrative and we tell stories about ourselves. And from a neuroscience perspective, there we often talk about wetware. And wetware is the application of hardware and software to biological forms. And that's what humans are, is we are that kind of wetware. And sometimes we can reduce ourselves, in computational neuroscience, for instance, we reduce ourselves to a series of computations that happen, a series of neurons that are firing in particular ways. We try to understand it that way. But there's more to it than that. There's more to human than being reduced to neurons and synaptic networks and so on. There's culture that overlays all of that. So although we may look at ourselves and we may say, any MRI machine will tell you that the hardware is all the same. Everybody has frontal lobes, everybody has hippocampus, everybody has a temporal lobe, and they're all located in exactly the same place, no matter where in the world you are. And yet we emerge with different narratives about ourselves. Where do those narratives come from? They come not from the internal, they come from the external in many ways, the culture that's imposed upon them. And that is wetware. And so given all of those themes is, I think, we lead to the question of how can we recast the humanities? How do we all find alternative ways of considering what humans are? How do we think critically in a different way? How do we not think within the boxes of these fossilized disciplines? How do we do political science differently? How do we do psychology differently, anthropology and sociology differently? How do we not just do them differently, but how do we make them speak to one another? And how do we make that conversation happen in a way that isn't bound by the colonial episteme? And when we do that, that is liberation in the truest sense. That is liberation where we untether ourselves from colonial legacies, not denying their influence and their presence, but engaging with them critically and realizing how they have influenced the way that we think about the world. So I want to conclude here by just a few things, is that's a few different questions that can maybe help us push some of the arguments further. And one is the language of crisis. So we know that this is that we are in a moment of crisis. We know that, but these crises are not these crises don't emerge out of nowhere. And also they're not experienced evenly. So what we have to realize is that societies in the global south are going to experience these crises differently than those in the global north. There are structural features of the world and the way that it's been created. And so, and these crises can intensify those historical patterns. And that what the humanities can try to do is to help us diagnose what is new about this crisis, but also how does this crisis stem from the historical continuities that have produced them? And I think that that's a really interesting question for us to engage with. A second interesting question I think for us to engage with is one about technology. And of course, we will all acknowledge that technology is not necessarily always enhancing human life, but it's not always disrupting human life as well. But technology by itself is just technology, and technologies always operate within particular political economies, within particular systems of power. How that technology is used is not so much a matter of the technology itself, but it emerges again from systems and from structures of power and of value. And the way that the humanities ought to consider this is, what is the benefit to humans of the technology? That's what I would argue is, how sustainable is it for us to engage with these technologies, and what does it mean for the world that we live in if we continue to engage with them in really unthinking and uncritical ways? But to always consider that technology by itself is purely technology. It is not, it doesn't emerge from nowhere, the way that it's used and the values that put on it. And then finally, acknowledging that we have lots of tasks ahead of us, is to rethink what the humanities are. Is their role diagnostic about what technology is, and how does it lead to inequalities? Is humanity supposed to open up new thoughts about life and possibility? Do humanities have to shape public discourse, education, and policy? And perhaps the answer is that it's all three things. It's diagnostic, it's imaginative, it is about institutions and about speaking to the power of those institutions and to thereby help us see the world differently. And I would say that that's a way to think about what the humanities do. And then the final thing then is to say, how do we approach that? How do we approach that task of doing it? And I think there are three things that I emphasize in the way that I think about leadership and the way I think about the humanities being the way that the humanities are in the world. And one is something that Prof. Ferris mentioned earlier, and that is courage. It is the intellectual courage to approach ideas in ways that are creative, to sometimes take unpopular positions, to speak truth to power, if you will. Then there is compassion, and that's the human side of things. And that is approaching others with compassion, because as Prof. Bogue said, humanity is about relations, not simply about productivity, and compassion is a key element of relation. And then the third is conviviality, which is approaching ideas and others with openness, with humility, and acknowledging that in many ways, we as people draw sustenance from exchanging and interchanging ideas in much the way that we've done here. So if we can use those three ways of interacting with the world, I think that the humanities would be in a better place. I will leave it there. Thank you very much, Prof. Bogues. This has been an extraordinary lecture and really something that's given us so much to think about.
Thank you very much, Professor Thomas. Really, thank you.
Professor Bogues, would you like to respond to Professor Thomas, or can we have a series of questions?
I can only, Prof. Connell, I can only say I agree with Professor Thomas. I may tweak a couple of things, but essentially, I agree with him. And really thank him for that summary of what I have said. So I would, perhaps the Q&A might be more productive to use that language.
Thank you very much. First, I'll give you two questions at a time. The first one, what responsibility do intellectuals and academics have in times when democratic values appear under pressure globally? And the second one, how can African universities and knowledge institutions strengthen their role in producing knowledge that speaks directly to African realities and aspirations?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me answer the first one. I think it's the role of the intellectual and the academic, and I in this regard I actually follow Stuart Hall a lot, where he makes a distinction between the academic and intellectual. That the academic is somebody who is very preoccupied with the questions of his or her disciplines, while the intellectual might be somebody who's more preoccupied with the questions of the day. Not that he or she is not preoccupied with the discipline, but he or she more focuses on what are the questions of the day that animates us at a particular point in time. I think there is one simple word, and that is courage. In other words, that one has to decide that in this world where things are being shut down, where thought is actually being at a crisis, where critical thought is becoming a terrain for deep crisis. And not just, I don't want to use the word crisis, overuse the word crisis here, but there's a way in which the horizons of thought, the ways in which you can say things are being shut down, and shut down in ways that tells you that you can't say this, or if you say this, then there are certain consequences. And so that for me, the role of the intellectual and the role of the academic is to be able to be critical of the society in which he or she lives, to point out to point out the difficulties, to point out the ways in which that society may not be meeting the aspirations of the people who inhabit that particular society. To do that, in my view, demands two things. It demands rigorous study of. You should just get up and say things without rigorous studies. But particularly if you're a scholar, intellectual, or academic. But also, secondly, it really demands courage. It demands the courage of your convictions to be able to say what needs to be said, and to say it in ways that does not, how should I put, does not create a kind of thing where it is, it's quarrelsome. We will get to quarrels in due course, but that you begin, when one begins to think and speak out about what is the direction of society is going in, what is wrong with it, why does it create difficulties for ordinary people, and so on. That you don't begin with a quarrel. You begin with a certain diagnostic understanding of the society, and then move forward. How can we, you have a quarrel with the society, but the way in which you present it, in my view, is a diagnostic of what the society is, which requires, as I said, serious study. The African University, I tend, Professor Connell and colleagues, not to give prescription to places where I don't live. I think that's a certain arrogance of those of us who are academics and intellectuals. All I would say in this is the following, that it would seem to me that the African University, like the Caribbean University, I'm from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, needs to think about this business of a certain kind of criticality, needs to think about how it can place at the heart of it, not now questions of development, which is which is how sometimes it is thought about, but needs to place at the heart of it a certain kind of understanding of criticality and a certain capacity to intervene in public discourse. And to do that in many countries also will create difficulties. But it also means, in my view, that the African University and the Caribbean University has to think, as it develops its voice of criticality, has to think about how does it, and I don't like this word because it has become a fad, how does it begin to decolonize the colonial episteme that guides many of the studies that we are talking about. And that to me really becomes extremely important. How do you think about the local in fundamental ways that can overturn the kind of episteme that governs particularly the humanities in many of our countries?
Thank you very much. The following two questions on the chat. The first one, in an age of information overload and rapid digital communication, how can we continue to tell meaningful stories about culture and humanity in ways that foster deeper understanding rather than superficial engagement? Is the first one. And then the second one, thank you for this lecture. Does this mean then that post-structuralist perspectives are indispensable to the humanities? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me answer the second one first. I don't know what, I mean, post-structuralism is such a loaded phrase. There's a whole, school of it that, school of thought around it that draws a lot from French philosophy and so on. I tend to operate in a different direction. I tend to operate in a direction which draws from the people who you hear me quote: Sylvia Winters, Stuart Hall, Amilcar Cabral, Frantz Fanon, etc. That's a different kind of tradition. That's not a post-structuralist tradition. That's a very much a radical anti-colonial position, or a Black radical position, if you prefer that nomenclature. I think that we need to, in both in Africa and the Caribbean, we need to think hard about the traditions of thought that we have actually created, and to study those and to begin and to use those, put those in our toolbox as a way in which we can perform a sort of analysis, diagnostic analysis about the societies in which we live. I am not opposed to structuralism. I'm not opposed to critical theory from Europe or any of those things. What I would urge is that those kind of models of thinking, as all systems of thought, emerge from certain conditions, and that the conditions may not will certainly the conditions of France and where French post-structuralism emerged is not the conditions of Africa, is not the conditions of the Caribbean. And therefore, what I'm trying to do and argue for is a much tighter fit, if to use that language, between traditions of thought and the realities in which we live in. That every system of thought, whether it is French, German, British, or whatever, every system of thought actually has a very close relationship to the actual realities on the ground, if you use that kind of language. And if you think about systems of thought, not just as a series of answers, but more as a series of questions posed, then you will see that for French post-structuralism, there's a series of questions that are being posed in their tradition that comes out of a set of arguments, comes out of a set of reality that exists in France at a particular time, particularly after May 1968. We have to begin to think about what are the realities of our society, and therefore what are the set of categories we can begin to create that explain those particular realities. So that's how I would respond to that question. The digital question is a lot more complicated in my view. It is the ways in which the digital has taken over the world, particularly the young, right, or younger than my generation, right, is I think really critical and something that we need to think through very hard as scholars, and for some people, some who are policymakers. And the way the digital is constructed is that what becomes dominant is how power constructs, those who are powerful construct and dominate the terrain, construct stories which can be told in 2 minutes or less than 2 minutes. In other words, there's no evidence, and the neuroscientists can talk more about this. There's no evidence that, in fact, it makes it difficult for us to have serious and profound discussions, because serious and profound discussions demand time. And so that to think about the digital is to think about how two things. One, how it has, if you wish, create a certain kind of human, or is creating a certain kind of human in which the capacity for deep thought is being stymied as the way in which the visual image works to reproduce itself and to reproduce a certain understanding of a particular moment. So, but there are also possibilities of creating different stories even within that frame. And here I'm thinking, for example, and that's only because I'm at Duke, where there's a conference on Sylvia Winter and her papers, that of how I have seen short things of about 9-10 minutes 9/11 minutes, in which people are creating stories about a winter, a Fanon, and folks like that, and trying to tell their stories, and they become more like teasers in many ways for us, for the person who's watching them, to begin to want to be interested much more. My final point about the digital is that those of us who are humanities scholars may want to think about the business of the visual and film as well alongside the books and the scriber. In other words, that there's a question of what some of us call publics, which is an awful phrase, but let me use it for legibility, about how you then make do films and engage in a visual process like exhibitions, that does what? That actually engages publics, that can become ways in which people can begin to think differently about a particular kind of subject. So for me, the digital is critical. It can be rearranged, I think. But in trying to think about the digital, I would like to also put on the table the business of the visual and the creation, but in particular of a visual language for us as African and African diasporic peoples, in which we can begin to tell our own stories.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Prof. Bogues. And wrapping up the question, there are several others, but we will end on this one. Speaking of hierarchies, how can institutions and governments be deliberate in the transformation of the current tokenism to inclusivity when it comes to indigenous languages as part of the decolonial project? 30 years after the dawn of democracy, indigenous languages in South Africa are still marginalized. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think nothing happens, and my colleagues at universities may throw their hands up in the air. Nothing happens without demand, and nothing and organized demand. And so I think that that universities, both in the Caribbean, and because there's a language in the Caribbean called Jamaican, is called Nation language by people like Camo Brathwaite and Herbert Devonish, how to get those things in, how to get these languages in the mainstream becomes quite frankly a intellectual and political process of demand. And I would just say that it is about, those demands require leadership on the ground, but also requires leadership from the various institutions themselves to be sensitive to those demands. I can't say what is the practical thing one must do on the ground, again, because I shy away from prescriptions when one doesn't live in a place. But certainly, I think that what one is thinking about is how to make demands and how to make those demands in ways that you might have, that leadership may respond to it, and then how, as well, how to have leadership that responds to these kind of things. So what kind of leadership in institutions do we have?
On that note, Professor Bogues, thank you from the bottom of my heart. But I'd now like to ask Dr. Malusi Twala, who's the Manager, Science Advisory and Strategic Partnerships at ASSAf, for the vote of thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the opportunity, Prof. Shona. Firstly, on behalf of the Academy of Science of South Africa, I really want to express our sincere gratitude to Professor Anthony Bogues. The lecture that you delivered, the insights that you shared on what we are as humans, the importance of representativity, are aspects that have particular importance to this country as we are continually preoccupied with who we are, what society we want to be, the diversity and richness of languages that we have, the contradicting historical experiences and culture. And importantly, how we relate with one another is currently shaping the South Africa that we're going to see going forward. So you left us really with a lot to think about going forward. We are really appreciative. I'd also like to thank all the participants that joined to listen to this lecture. We really appreciate that you took your time out of your other, important aspects to join the Academy of South Africa in this engagement. We had a lineup of speakers who delivered different items. Firstly, I would like to thank our program director, Professor Shona O'Connell, for facilitating today's session, which I think really went smoothly. Also, our member of council who registered opening remarks on behalf of the Academy, Professor Loretta Ferris. We are really grateful that you could be with us today. And the dissection that we had from Professor Kevin Thomas on the lecture was really an insightful reflection, and he further himself, gave some additional insights based on what Professor Bogus had shared with us. So we're really grateful to that. And today's event would not have been possible without Professor Shona's and her ASSAf standing committee, which actually was instrumental in nominating and endorsing Professor Bogues to be our humanities lecture speaker today. So to the rest of the humanities standing committee under your guidance, Professor Shona, we are really, really grateful. And it seems this series is just growing year on year in terms of what we actually receive. Ms. Raj Mahabir, our other host for today, we are really thankful that you played an instrumental role in, organizing the many balls that we're dropping to ensure that today's lecture takes place and goes smoothly. To the other colleagues at ASSAf, Henriette Litabo and Renata and many others who ensured that we actually received today's lecture in the manner that we did. We are really thankful. As the Academy of Science of South Africa, we are committed to maintaining science engagement in open platforms such as this one and in this nature by looking at various focus areas that affect society today. And we'll continue to do this in a way that connects with other international societies, international scholars as well, since we are all living in one, globe. And on that note, I would really like to thank all of you, and I hand back to you, Prof. Shona. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Bogues, I hope you don't unpack your suitcases too quickly. I look forward to working with my colleagues at the University of Cape Town and Professor Leora Faber at the University of Johannesburg, and with my colleagues at the University of Pretoria to bring you to our shores. I think this is the beginning of a conversation that I think we'd love to have you here. On behalf of ASSAf and the committee, Raj, you've been an absolute joy to work with. And to my colleagues at UP, thank you very much and goodbye.